If I can't have that land, nobody can. Blackwood's gun swung toward Kate. James saw the finger tighten on the trigger. He had 1 second to decide. Let the woman he loved die or take the bullet himself. He moved without thinking. The gunshot echoed across the Wyoming prairie. When the smoke cleared, one man lay bleeding in the snow, and a love story that began with a frozen grave was about to be written in blood. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back. Back to a bitter January morning when a stranger helped bury a child he'd never known. January 10, 1886. James Caldwell had buried 3 people he loved in his life. He never expected the 4th burial would be for a stranger's child, or that it would thaw the ice around his heart. The morning was bitter cold, the kind that made breath freeze in the air and turned Wyoming prairie into endless white. James sat tall in the saddle, his horse picking its way along the northwestern boundary of his ranch. 20 years he'd ridden this fence line. 20 years of checking posts, counting cattle, scanning horizons that seemed to stretch forever under skies that promised nothing but more winter. The leather reins felt stiff in his gloved hands. Even through thick cowhide, the cold penetrated, settling into bones that remembered warmer days. Days when Elizabeth had been alive to greet him at the door. Days when the house didn't echo with silence. 3 years. 3 years since he'd dug 2 graves in one day and buried the only future he'd imagined. His wife, his son, both gone before the baby had drawn a single breath. James had been 20 miles away tending cattle during a difficult calving season, thinking he had time, thinking he'd make it back before labor started. He'd been wrong. The memory sat heavy in his chest, a weight he'd learned to carry but never put down. Work helped. 16-hour days helped. Exhaustion helped. Anything to avoid the moment when he climbed into an empty bed and felt the absence like a physical thing. His mind was on ordinary concerns this morning. Cattle counts. Hay stores. The calving season starting in March. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing that suggested this day would be different from the 1,000 identical days that had come before. The sky hung low and gray, promising more snow by nightfall. James noted it automatically, the way a man does when his survival depends on reading weather. Another storm meant another few days trapped indoors. Another few days with nothing but his thoughts for company. Then he saw her. A small, dark figure in the valley cemetery struggling with something. Even from a quarter-mile away he could see the futility written in every movement of her body. The shovel rising and falling, the earth refusing to yield, the desperate losing battle against frozen ground. James reined in his horse, squinting against the glare of sun on snow. Recognition dawned slowly. Evelyn Morrison. No, not Evelyn. Catherine. They called her Kate, the widow who'd settled a hardscrabble claim 2 miles east last autumn. He'd seen her in town once or twice, always alone, always with that look of fierce determination that came from having no choice but to be strong. A young woman, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to carry more grief than any one person should bear. Now she was in the cemetery swinging a shovel against ground that had been frozen solid for 6 weeks. Nothing short of dynamite would break it. James urged his horse forward. As he drew closer, details emerged that made his chest tighten. The small pine coffin resting in the snow beside her. Rough-hewn, hastily made. The kind of coffin a person builds when they can't afford to pay someone else. When they have to do everything themselves because there's no one else to do it. A child's coffin. Kate didn't hear him approach. The wind carried sound away across the empty prairie, and she was focused entirely on her impossible task. James dismounted slowly, leading his horse the last 30 yards. He moved quietly, not wanting to startle her. The shovel rang against earth hard as iron. The sound echoed across the frozen landscape, sharp and futile. Kate put her whole body into the swing, shoulders and back and arms working together. The blade struck ground. Nothing yielded. Not even a chip of frozen dirt. She staggered from the impact, the shock traveling up the handle and into her shoulders. James saw her catch herself steady. Her stance raised the shovel again. Her hands were shaking. Her face was gray with exhaustion and cold. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She'd been crying, but her tears had frozen on her cheeks, leaving tracks of ice. "Ma'am," James said quietly. She spun around, shovel raised like a weapon. Her eyes were wild for a moment, unfocused. Then recognition flickered. She lowered the shovel slightly, but didn't let go. "I don't need help." Her voice was breaking the words, barely holding together. James looked at the tiny coffin, at the ground that mocked her efforts, at hands that trembled but wouldn't quit. He saw himself 3 years ago, digging in different ground, different graves, same desperate solitude. "I know you don't," he said simply. He stepped forward and gently took the shovel from her grip. "But I'm going to help anyway." For a moment he thought she'd fight. Her fingers tightened on the handle. Pride and exhaustion warred in her eyes. Then her hands fell to her sides. She sank to her knees beside the coffin, one hand resting on its rough pine surface. James positioned himself and drove the shovel down with all his strength. The ground resisted, then grudgingly it gave. A tiny bit, maybe half an inch. He worked the blade back and forth, leveraging his weight using technique learned from years of hard labor. A chunk of frozen earth broke free, small, pitiful, but progress. It was going to take hours. James set his jaw and kept digging. Kate knelt beside the coffin, silent as stone. The only sounds were his shovel striking earth, his breathing growing heavier with effort, and the wind moving through the bare branches of a cottonwood tree at the cemetery's edge. Swing, strike, lever, remove dirt, repeat. His shoulders began to burn after the first 15 minutes. Sweat formed on his neck despite the cold freezing almost immediately. The hole deepened with agonizing slowness. 6 inches, 8 inches, a foot. An hour passed, maybe more. Time became meaningless, measured only in inches of depth achieved. James's hands ached even through his gloves. His back protested. He ignored it all and kept digging. The sound of approaching horses made him look up. 2 riders crested the hill. Henry Cooper and old Thomas Reed, his hired hands. They must have seen his horse from the ranch, wondered why he'd stopped here so long. They took in the scene with one glance. James digging, the woman kneeling, the small coffin. No words were necessary. Some things transcend explanation. Henry dismounted without speaking. He walked to his saddle and pulled out a pickaxe he'd brought for fence work. Thomas joined him carrying another shovel. Together they began working alongside James. 3 men digging a grave for a child they'd never known. 1 woman keeping vigil beside a daughter she'd never see grow up. The hole deepened. 2 feet, 3 feet, deep enough. The work took another 40 minutes. When they finally stepped back, the grave was ready. Rough maybe, but adequate. More than adequate. It was a gift of labor and time freely given to a stranger. Henry stepped back first, removing his hat. Thomas and James did the same. 3 men standing bareheaded in the cold, honoring a life they'd never met. Kate stood on legs that trembled. She'd been kneeling in the snow for nearly 2 hours. Her skirt was soaked through. She had to be frozen. But she moved to the coffin with steady purpose. She bent and lifted it. The pine box was so light. That was the cruelty of it. Rose had weighed almost nothing in life. In death, she was lighter still. James moved to help, but Kate shook her head. She needed to do this part herself, this final act of motherhood, this last carrying. She knelt at the grave's edge and lowered the coffin with shaking arms. The box settled on frozen earth with a soft sound that seemed too quiet for something so final. Kate stayed kneeling, staring down. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Private words for private grief. James had seen grief before. He'd lost his younger sister Margaret to scarlet fever when he was 14. He'd watched his father dig her grave, watched his mother stop speaking for 3 months afterward. He'd stood at graves of friends, neighbors, hired men killed in accidents. But this, a mother burying her only child alone in January snow. This was different. He reached into his coat and pulled out the worn Bible he always carried. His mother's Bible. The pages were familiar, creased from use. He'd carried this through 3 years of war. Through battles where men fell like wheat before a scythe. Through Elizabeth's funeral and his nameless sons. He hadn't read from it since then. Couldn't. The words had felt empty after such loss. But now, standing in this frozen cemetery with a stranger's grief laid bare, he felt the weight of obligation. Not to God, perhaps, but to something. Humanity, maybe. The simple duty one person owes another in the face of unbearable sorrow. "Ma'am," he said gently, "if you'd permit me." Kate looked up at him with empty eyes. She nodded once. James's hands were stiff with cold as he opened the Bible. He didn't turn to the usual funeral passages. Those felt too formal, too distant. Instead, he turned to the Song of Solomon, to words his mother had read at Margaret's funeral, words about love that endures. "Set me as a seal upon thy heart." James read, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his throat. "As a seal upon thine arm, for love is strong as death. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it." The words hung in the frozen air. Kate's shoulders began to shake. Then the sobs came, wrenching sounds that seemed torn from somewhere deep, raw, broken, the kind of grief that has no comfort. James kept reading. "He shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs with his arm and carry them in his bosom." The passage felt inadequate. All words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. So he read them steady and slow, letting them fill the silence. When he finished, he closed the Bible carefully. The silence that followed felt sacred somehow, holy in a way that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the simple acknowledgement of pain. James nodded to his men. Together they began filling the grave, working gently, respectfully. Henry found 2 sturdy pine branches and lashed them together with leather cord from his saddle, forming a simple cross. The mound of earth grew. James patted it smooth with the back of the shovel. Henry placed the cross at its head, driving it deep enough to withstand the wind. "She'll need a proper stone come spring," Thomas said quietly to James. "I can carve one," Thomas added. "That'll be good," James replied. Kate hadn't moved. She stood beside the grave, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the fresh-turned earth. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon. Temperature would plummet once darkness fell. James glanced at his men. They understood. "We'll head back to the ranch," Henry said. He touched his hat brim toward Kate. "Ma'am, you have our sympathies." Thomas nodded his agreement. They mounted and rode off, leaving James alone with the widow. "Where's your place?" James asked. 2 miles east," Kate said. Her voice sounded distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "I'll follow you home. Make sure you get there safe." She turned to look at him. For a moment he thought she'd refuse. Then she just nodded and walked to her horse tied to the cemetery fence. She mounted stiffly, moving like someone much older than her years. James swung onto his own horse and followed as she rode out of the cemetery. He kept his distance, not crowding her. The sun set behind them, painting the snow orange and pink. Beautiful if you could see beauty through grief. Kate rode with her back straight, but James could see her shoulders shake with silent sobs. Her cabin came into view, a small structure tucked against a hillside for wind protection. Smoke rose from the chimney. She must have left a fire burning before she came to the cemetery. Kate dismounted and went inside without looking back. A moment later, lamplight appeared in the window. James waited until he was certain she was safe inside. Then he turned his horse toward home. The ride back gave him time to think, time to remember. Elizabeth's death had nearly destroyed him. For months afterward he'd functioned but not lived, going through motions, working until exhaustion made sleep possible, avoiding anything that reminded him of what he'd lost. His father had done the same after Margaret died, worked himself into an early grave, unable to bear the weight of grief. His mother had withdrawn into silence, a ghost in her own house. The family had broken from the inside out. James had sworn he wouldn't follow that path, but knowing and doing were different things. 3 years later he was still alone, still working 16-hour days, still avoiding the empty spaces in his life. Tonight, helping bury Kate's child, something had shifted. He couldn't name it yet, couldn't define it. But digging that grave with Henry and Thomas, reading those words over a child he'd never known, had cracked something open inside him. Grief had two paths, he realized. His father had chosen isolation, and it had killed him. His mother had chosen silence, and it had hollowed her out. But today James had chosen differently. He'd chosen to help, to be present in someone else's pain, and somehow in helping bury a stranger's child, he'd honored his sister's memory more than 20 years of solitary mourning ever had. The ranch house was dark when he arrived. Cold. Empty. It always was. James put his horse away, fed the animals, checked the cattle one last time. Normal routines that kept him grounded. Inside, he lit a fire and sat in front of it, still wearing his coat. The heat took time to penetrate the cold that had settled into his bones. He thought about Kate, about the cabin 2 miles east where she sat alone right now, about the tiny grave in the valley cemetery where a child named Rose lay beneath frozen ground. He thought about the way Kate had refused help at first, pride mixed with desperation. The same pride he'd felt when Elizabeth died and neighbors had come offering casseroles and condolences he couldn't accept. He thought about her hands on that coffin, the tenderness of it, the unbearable weight of that final goodbye. And he made a decision. Tomorrow he would check on her, not out of pity. Pity was useless, but out of understanding, because someone should have checked on him after Elizabeth died and no one had. Because isolation was a choice, and he'd made it, and it had cost him 3 years of half-life. He wouldn't let Kate make the same mistake. The fire burned low. James didn't move to add wood. He sat in the growing darkness, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. Not the empty purpose of work and survival. Real purpose. The kind that came from connection, from choosing to step into someone else's pain instead of running from your own. Outside, the wind picked up. Snow began to fall again, soft and steady. By morning, new drifts would cover the cemetery, would cover Rose's grave. The world would look clean and white and innocent. But beneath that fresh snow, the ground would still be frozen. The graves would still be there. The grief would still be real. James finally stood and added wood to the fire. He made coffee, though it was late, sat at his table with the cup warming his hands. The house creaked in the wind. Empty rooms echoed. But for the first time in 3 years, the emptiness didn't feel quite so suffocating. Tomorrow he would load his wagon with firewood, would bring supplies Kate probably needed but wouldn't ask for, would find some excuse to check on her without making it seem like charity. He didn't know what would come of it, didn't have expectations beyond basic human decency, but he knew he couldn't walk away, couldn't leave her to face this alone. The coffee grew cold in his hands. James stared into the fire and remembered a young woman kneeling beside a pine coffin, remembered the dignity in her grief, the strength it took to refuse help even when drowning. And he remembered something else, something he'd almost forgotten in 3 years of numbness. He remembered what it felt like to care about someone else's pain. The night stretched long. James didn't sleep well, never did. But tonight the usual nightmares were joined by new images. A small coffin, frozen ground, a woman's frozen tears, and in the spaces between nightmares, something else, something that might have been hope if he'd been willing to name it. Morning came cold and clear. James rose before dawn as always, fed the stock, checked the cattle, loaded a wagon with split firewood and supplies, flour, coffee, lamp oil, things a widow alone might need. Henry found him in the barn loading the last of the wood. "You taking supplies to the Morrison widow?" Henry asked, no judgment in his voice, just curiosity. "She'll need firewood," James said. "Winter's not done." "Eleanor Thornton won't like it," Henry observed. "She's been talking." Eleanor Thornton, the town busybody, leader of the Ladies' Church Society, guardian of public morality, or so she claimed. James had heard the whispers, knew Eleanor had opinions about everything and everyone. "I don't care what Eleanor Thornton likes," James said. Henry smiled slightly. "Good, because that woman's got more poison in her than a rattlesnake." James didn't disagree. He finished loading and climbed onto the wagon seat. "I'll be back by noon," he said. "Take your time," Henry replied. "We'll manage." The ride to Kate's cabin took 20 minutes. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering the world in pristine white. The wagon tracks were the first to mar it. Kate's cabin looked small and vulnerable against the vast landscape. Smoke rose from the chimney. Good. She'd kept the fire going. James pulled the wagon up and knocked on the door. Waited. Knocked again. Finally the door opened. Kate stood there wrapped in a shawl. She looked worse than yesterday. Eyes red and swollen. Face pale. She'd been crying all night, he guessed. "Morning," James said. "Brought firewood. Thought you might be running low." "I have enough," Kate said automatically. "Then you'll have more," James replied. He started unloading without waiting for permission. Kate watched for a moment. He could feel her weighing options. Pride against practicality. Finally, she stepped outside. "There's coffee," she said, "if you want." It was an olive branch, an acceptance. James nodded. "I'd appreciate that." They worked in silence, stacking wood against the cabin wall. When the wagon was empty, James noticed the barn door hanging crooked. "Your door's hanging wrong," he observed. "Hinge broke," Kate said. "I've been meaning to fix it." "I'll do it now if you've got spare hardware." She showed him where Daniel's tools were kept. Her husband's tools, James realized, probably hadn't been touched since he died. James worked efficiently, removing the broken hinge and replacing it with one from Daniel's collection. The door swung smoothly when he finished. "Thank you," Kate said. The words felt small, inadequate for what he'd done. Not just the door, the grave, the reading, the firewood. "Coffee?" James asked. She nodded and led him to the cabin. Inside he saw the life she'd tried to build. Books on a shelf. Whitman, Emerson, the Bible. A violin hanging on the wall. Rose's empty cradle by the window, a blanket still tucked inside, as if waiting for a baby who would never return. The sight of that cradle hit him harder than he'd expected. His own son had never had a cradle, had never had anything. Born dead, buried within hours. Kate poured coffee from the pot on the stove. They sat at her table. The same table where she'd sat alone last night, probably. The same table where she'd eaten meals with her husband before he died, where she'd fed her baby. "Your cattle look thin," James said. "You got enough hay, enough to get through." "I'll bring some extra, no charge. I've got surplus this year." Kate wanted to refuse. He could see it in her eyes. But her cattle needed food. Pride couldn't feed livestock. "That's generous," she said instead. They drank coffee in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. James seemed content to sit quietly, and Kate found she didn't mind the company. The silence was broken by Kate's question. "Why are you doing this?" James considered. He could lie, could say it was just neighborly. But something about this woman, about her raw grief and fierce dignity, demanded honesty. "3 years ago," he said slowly, "my wife died. Elizabeth. She died giving birth. I wasn't there. I was 20 miles away tending cattle because I thought I had time, thought I'd get back before labor started." He paused. Kate waited. "I didn't. By the time I got home she was gone. The baby too. A son." He never drew breath. "I'm sorry," Kate whispered. "I dug 2 graves that day," James continued. "Elizabeth and our boy. I dug them alone because I'd pushed everyone away. Grief does that. Makes you think you deserve the pain. That accepting help means you didn't love them enough." He met her eyes. "I see you making the same choice, choosing to suffer alone, and I can't watch that happen again." Kate's throat tightened. "I don't know how to be anything else." "I know. Neither did I. But yesterday, helping you bury Rose, reading those words, it was the first time in 3 years I felt like maybe grief doesn't have to destroy you. Maybe it can connect you instead." They sat with that. The truth of shared pain, the possibility that survival didn't mean isolation. Finally Kate spoke. Her name was Rose, 8 months old. Whooping cough took her in 3 days. I rode 8 miles in the dark to fetch Dr. Morrison. He came, but it was too late. "Tell me about her," James said. So she did. About Rose's first smile at 2 months, about how she'd grab Kate's hair and laugh, about the sound of her crying in the night, a sound Kate would give anything to hear again. James listened, didn't try to fix it or minimize it, just listened. And somehow in that small cabin with snow falling outside, two broken people found the beginning of something neither had expected. Not healing, not yet, but maybe the possibility of it. When James left an hour later, Kate stood in her doorway watching him go. For the first time since Rose died, she felt marginally less alone. Back at the ranch, Henry saw the look on James's face. "How is she?" he asked. "Surviving," James said. "Barely. You going back tomorrow and the day after, as long as she needs." Henry nodded approvingly. "Good man." But as James put away his horse and returned to work, he had no idea that his decision to help had set events in motion. Events that would threaten everything. Because in a town as small as theirs, gossip spread like wildfire. And Eleanor Thornton was already talking. By Thursday afternoon, when the Ladies' Church Society gathered for their weekly meeting, Eleanor had crafted her narrative perfectly. She knew exactly how to frame concern as charity judgment, as protection. The Ladies' Church Society met every Thursday afternoon in the rectory behind the white clapboard church. 12 women gathered around a long table, ostensibly to plan charitable works and discuss matters of faith. In reality, these meetings served a different purpose entirely. Eleanor Thornton presided from the head of the table. At 58, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime proving her worth. Her gray hair was pulled back severely. Her dress was expensive but austere. Black, always black, though her husband had been dead for 15 years. She waited until the tea was poured and the women had settled before beginning. "Ladies," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the particular tone of concern that preceded judgment, "I'm worried about a member of our community." The women leaned forward. This was what they came for. The possibility of scandal barely concealed beneath a veneer of Christian charity. "The Morrison widow," Eleanor continued. "Catherine, such a tragic situation, losing her husband, now her baby. My heart breaks for her." Murmurs of agreement circled the table. "Of course," Eleanor said, pausing for effect, "which makes it all the more important that we protect her. A young woman alone, vulnerable, susceptible to those who might take advantage." "Take advantage?" Mrs. Davies asked right on cue. "I hesitate to speak of it," Eleanor said, not hesitating at all, "but James Caldwell has been visiting, frequently, 3 times this week alone." Silence, then whispers. "Surely Mr. Caldwell is just being neighborly," said Margaret Cross, the Reverend's wife, a kind woman who always looked for the best in people. Eleanor smiled thinly. Of course. Though one wonders at a bachelor visiting a young widow so regularly, alone, unchaperoned, people do talk. "What are you suggesting, Eleanor?" Margaret asked, an edge in her voice. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply observing that appearances matter. The poor woman has enough to deal with without becoming the subject of gossip. We should perhaps speak to her, gently, make her aware of how things look." What Eleanor didn't say, what she would never say, was the real poison in her heart. The reason James Caldwell's kindness to an outsider felt like a personal insult. 30 years ago, Eleanor had loved a man, Robert Caldwell, James's father. She'd loved him with the desperate intensity of a young woman who'd grown up poor, who'd sewn dresses for the wealthy while dreaming of being wealthy herself. Robert had been handsome, ambitious, hard-working, everything she'd wanted. And for a brief shining moment she'd thought he wanted her too, until he'd chosen Sarah Wheeler instead. Sarah with her land inheritance, Sarah with her family connections, Sarah with everything Eleanor lacked. The rejection had burned, still burned. Every time Eleanor saw James tall and successful and respected, she saw the life she should have had, the status that should have been hers. And now, watching James show kindness to another outsider, another woman society looked down on, felt like the universe mocking her. If Robert could have loved across class lines, why hadn't he loved her? If the Caldwell men could see worth in women without status, Why had she been rejected? The unfairness of it poisoned everything. Eleanor brought the meeting to order and moved on to other topics. But the seed had been planted. By sunset, half the town would know about James's visits. By morning, everyone would be talking. What Eleanor didn't know was that her gossip would reach dangerous ears, that her poison would be weaponized by someone with far darker intentions. Samuel Blackwood had an office above the general store, a modest space that belied his actual influence. On paper, he was a land agent. He helped people file homestead claims, settle boundary disputes, navigate the complex web of territorial land laws. In reality, he was something else entirely. Blackwood dealt in opportunities, in finding leverage, in discovering what people wanted and figuring out how to profit from it. He had connections in Cheyenne, friends in the territorial government who could make documents appear or disappear, judges who owed him favors. He was 45, well-dressed, with the smooth manners of someone who'd learned to hide his true nature beneath a veneer of respectability. On this particular Thursday afternoon, he sat at his desk reviewing geological survey maps. Wyoming territory was full of untapped resources: coal, copper, gold maybe. The key was finding it before others did, securing the land rights, then selling at enormous profit. His attention was on a particular section east of town, 200 acres that showed promising signs of coal deposits. Not a huge vein, but substantial enough to be worth several $1,000s. The problem was ownership. The land had been claimed 2 years ago by Daniel Morrison. Homestead claim. 5 years continuous residence required to prove ownership and gain title. Daniel Morrison had died 14 months into his residence. Normally, that would invalidate the claim, but his widow could inherit if she proved continuous residence in her husband's name. Blackwood had been watching the situation, waiting. The widow was struggling. Anyone could see that. Sooner or later, she'd give up and leave. Then the land would revert to public domain, and Blackwood could claim it himself. That had been the plan, until he'd overheard Eleanor Thornton gossiping in the general store below his office. The Morrison widow, poor thing. James Caldwell visiting 3 times a week, bringing supplies, staying for hours. One wonders. Blackwood's interest sharpened. James Caldwell, the most successful rancher in the county, a man of means and influence. If Caldwell was helping the widow, she might not give up after all, might find the resources to hold on to the land, to complete the 5-year residence requirement. That was unacceptable. Blackwood pulled out the Morrison file, studied the homestead claim documents, and found what he was looking for: a technicality, a gap in residence dates that could be exploited. According to the original filing, Daniel Morrison had claimed the land in October 1884. He'd died in September 1885, 11 months. But the documents showed he'd left the property from February to May 1885, 3 months' absence. That broke the continuous residence requirement. The claim could be challenged, invalidated, except Blackwood knew those dates were wrong. He'd filed the amended record himself just last month, backdating it to look official. The real dates showed no gap in residence, but proving that would require the widow to fight, to hire a lawyer, to spend money and time she didn't have. Most people gave up when confronted with legal complications, especially vulnerable people, widows, immigrants, anyone without resources. Blackwood made a decision. He'd visit Mrs. Morrison, present the problem, offer a solution, buy the land for a fraction of its worth, and if she refused, well, there were other methods of persuasion. He gathered his papers and headed downstairs. Time to see just how desperate this widow really was. Kate was feeding her chickens when Blackwood arrived. The afternoon sun slanted low, painting long shadows across the snow. She looked up at the sound of a horse and saw a well-dressed man approaching, riding a fine mare, expensive saddle, someone with money. She straightened immediately, wary. Men with money didn't visit poor widows without reason. "Mrs. Morrison," the man called out pleasantly. "Samuel Blackwood. Might I have a word?" Kate's hand tightened on the feed bucket. "About what?" "A legal matter concerning your property. It won't take long." Every instinct told her to refuse, to send him away. But legal matters couldn't be ignored. She set down the bucket and led him inside. The cabin felt smaller with a stranger in it. Blackwood removed his hat, revealing carefully pomaded hair. He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "I'll be direct, ma'am," he said. "I've been reviewing county records. Your late husband's homestead claim has a problem." Kate's stomach dropped. What kind of problem? Blackwood spread papers on her table, official-looking documents with stamps and signatures. Daniel Morrison filed his claim October 1884. The law requires 5 years continuous residence to gain title, but he died September 1885, only 11 months. "The claim passes to me," Kate said. "I can complete the residence requirement." "Normally, yes, but there's this." Blackwood pointed to a line in the document. "February to May 1885, 3 months absence. Your husband left the property. That breaks continuous residence." Kate felt the blood drain from her face. Daniel had left in February, gone back to Missouri to marry her to bring her here. They'd traveled together in May. But 3 months absence. That would invalidate everything. "He went to get me," she said, "to bring me here. We were married there. That's not abandonment." "The law doesn't distinguish between abandonment and other absence," Blackwood said smoothly. 3 months is 3 months. The claim is invalid." "That's not right. There must be exceptions for marriage for family." "Perhaps. You'd need to argue that before a judge, hire a lawyer, file an appeal. That process takes months, costs money." He paused. "Money you don't have." Kate stood, hands shaking. "What do you want?" "To help you. I have a client interested in purchasing the property. He's willing to pay $500. Fair price considering the circumstances. You could start fresh. Somewhere easier, somewhere without so much hardship." "This is my home." "Is it?" Blackwood's voice turned colder. "Or is it a reminder of everything you've lost your husband buried out there? Your baby girl. Every day here must be torture." "Get out." Blackwood stood slowly, gathering his papers. "I'll give you 1 week to consider. After that, I'll have no choice but to file with the territorial court. They'll evict you. You'll get nothing. At least my offer gives you something." I said, "Get out." He smiled that empty smile again. 1 week, Mrs. Morrison. Think carefully. $500 is generous for land you don't legally own." He left. Kate stood in her cabin trembling. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to break down and weep. Instead, she sat at the table and forced herself to think. The dates Blackwood had shown, February to May, 3 months. That would break continuous residence if true, but they weren't true. Daniel had left February 10th. She had his letter dated February 12th saying he'd arrived in Missouri safely. They'd married March 1st, left Missouri April 15th, arrived here May 1st. 6 weeks, not 3 months. Either the official records were wrong, or they'd been altered. She needed help. Needed someone who understood how the legal system worked, someone who could fight this. She needed James, but asking for help felt like admitting defeat, like proving everyone right who said she couldn't survive alone, that a woman needed a man to protect her. Kate sat in the growing darkness, pride warring with necessity. Outside the sun set. Inside the fire burned low. Finally, she made her decision. Tomorrow she'd ride to Caldwell Ranch. She'd ask for help. She just hoped James would give it. The next morning, Kate rose before dawn. She dressed carefully, choosing her least worn dress, braided her hair, tried to look less desperate than she felt. The ride to Caldwell Ranch took 30 minutes. Her hands were numb on the reins by the time she arrived. Henry Cooper was in the yard splitting wood. He looked up, surprised. "Mrs. Morrison, everything all right? I need to speak with James." Henry studied her face, saw the strain there. "He's in the barn. I'll fetch him." "Thank you." James emerged a minute later, concern immediate in his eyes. "Kate, what's wrong?" She told him. About Blackwood's visit. About the documents claiming Daniel had been absent for 3 months. about the threat of eviction. James listened, his jaw tightening. When she finished, he held out his hand. "Let me see those papers." She didn't have them. Blackwood had taken them, but she described what she'd seen. James thought for a moment. "The dates. You're sure they're wrong?" "Positive. Daniel left February 10th. We have letters proving it. We were married March 1st. Left Missouri April 15th. I can prove the timeline." "Then the records are forged. Blackwood's lying." "Can he do that?" "If he has connections in Cheyenne, if he's paid off the right people, yes. He can make the official record say whatever he wants. Proving fraud will require evidence, letters, witnesses, anything showing continuous residence." Kate's shoulders sagged. "I don't have money for lawyers." "Then we'll find another way." "Why?" The question burst out. "Why help me? Everyone in town already thinks you're taking advantage, that I'm using you. Why risk your reputation?" James was quiet a long moment. Then he stepped closer. "Come inside. There's something I need to tell you." In his cabin, James made coffee. They sat at his table. Kate waited. 3 years ago, James began, Elizabeth died. I told you that. What I didn't tell you was how it felt. The guilt, the rage, the absolute conviction that I deserved the pain because I hadn't been there." He paused. "I dug those graves alone, not because people didn't offer to help. They did. I refused. Thought accepting help meant I hadn't loved her enough. That suffering alone was how I honored her memory." "Did it help?" Kate asked quietly. "No. It nearly destroyed me. I worked until I collapsed, avoided everyone, turned my ranch into a prison, and myself into the only inmate." He met her eyes. "Helping you bury Rose. It was the first time in 3 years I felt like maybe grief doesn't have to be solitary. Maybe connection is how we survive it." "So you're helping me to help yourself." "Maybe. Is that wrong?" Kate considered. "No, I think it's honest." They sat with that honesty. Outside, Henry's axe rang against wood. Inside, two people faced the truth of mutual need. "I'm scared, James," Kate said. "Scared I'll lose this land. Scared I'll be alone again. Scared that if I let you help, if I let myself feel anything except grief, I'm betraying Rose, betraying Daniel." James reached across the table, took her hand. His palm was calloused warm, solid. "You're not betraying anyone," he said. "You're surviving. There's no shame in that." The tears she'd been holding back broke free. "I don't know how to stop being angry. At who? God, for taking her. Daniel, for leaving me alone. Myself, for not saving her. Everyone." "I know that anger," James said. "I've carried it for 3 years. Does it get better? It gets different. You make room for it. Learn to carry it without letting it carry you." They sat in silence, hands clasped. Outside, the morning advanced. Cattle lowed, chickens scratched. Life continued its relentless march forward. Finally, James spoke. "We'll fight Blackwood. Together. We'll gather every piece of evidence proving Daniel's residence. Letters, witnesses, anything. We'll build a case so strong even corrupt officials can't ignore it. And if we can't, then we fight harder. You're not losing this land, Kate. I won't let that happen." "Why, it's just land." "No. It's where you buried your husband. Your daughter. It's home, and everyone deserves to keep their home." Kate squeezed his hand. "Thank you. Thank you for letting me help." They made a plan. Tomorrow they'd ride to the county recorder's office, examine the original homestead filing, compare it to Blackwood's documents, find the proof they needed. But as Kate rode home that afternoon, she didn't know that Blackwood was already moving, that he'd sent word to his partners in Cheyenne, that forces were gathering against her, and she didn't know that in helping her, James had made powerful enemies. The storm that was coming would test them both in ways neither could imagine. 3 days later, Henry Cooper's 7-year-old son Tommy came running into Caldwell Ranch breathless and scared. "Pa, Mr. Caldwell, I saw something." Henry dropped the harness he was mending. "Slow down, boy. What did you see?" Men. 2 men I don't know. They were near Mrs. Morrison's place, hiding in the trees. James emerged from the barn. What men? I was fishing, down by her creek. They didn't see me, but I heard them talking. Tommy's voice shook. One said when Blackwood gives the word we move, she'll leave or she'll regret it. The other one said widow alone. Easy. The temperature in the yard seemed to drop. Henry's face went hard. James's hands clenched. How many? James asked. 2. Big men. They had guns. James and Henry exchanged looks, both thinking the same thing. Blackwood wasn't going to wait for legal proceedings. He was going to use force. Henry, ride to town. Get Thomas. Tell him to bring his rifle. Meet me at Kate's place. Where are you going? To make sure she's not there alone tonight. Henry grabbed his hat. James, if you're seen staying overnight at her cabin, Eleanor Thornton will have a field day. I don't give a damn what Eleanor Thornton thinks. Kate's life is more important than my reputation. James saddled his fastest horse and rode hard. 2 miles never felt so long. Every second he imagined arriving too late, finding Kate hurt, or worse. But when he crested the hill, her cabin stood peaceful in the afternoon light. Smoke rising from the chimney, chickens scratching in the yard. Then he noticed the sky. Dark clouds building in the northwest. That particular quality of light that meant a big storm coming. He'd lived in Wyoming long enough to read weather. This would be bad. 3 days maybe. Heavy snow, high winds. He urged his horse faster. Kate was outside struggling to drive her small herd of cattle toward the barn. The animals were spooked by the approaching storm, scattering instead of gathering. She was working alone, growing frustrated. James dismounted and moved to help without speaking. Together they worked the cattle, methodical, patient, driving them toward safety. The wind picked up. Temperature dropped. First snowflakes began falling. They got the last cow into the barn just as the storm hit with full force. Wind howled. Snow turned horizontal. Visibility dropped to nothing. Inside the barn, James's horse whinnied nervously. "Bring him in," Kate said, shouting over the wind. "There's room." James led his horse inside, unsaddled him, gave him feed and water. Through the barn walls they could hear the storm screaming. "Can't ride home in this," Kate observed. It wasn't a question. "No. I'll wait it out in the barn." "Don't be foolish. Come to the cabin." They ran the 30 yards from barn to cabin, bent against wind that tried to knock them over. Snow stung their faces, got in their eyes and mouths. By the time they burst through the door, both were gasping. James secured the door while Kate built up the fire. The cabin was small, 1 room with a loft. James saw her bed in the corner, Rose's empty cradle beside it. A wave of awareness hit him. They'd be alone together, possibly for days, in very close quarters. "I can sleep by the fire," he said. "Won't be the first time." "There are blankets in the chest," Kate replied, voice carefully neutral. The storm raged all day and through the night. Wind shook the cabin. Snow piled against the walls until they couldn't see out the windows. The world shrank to 1 room. They moved around each other carefully at first, maintaining polite distance. James sat by the fire cleaning his rifle, though it didn't need cleaning. Kate mended clothes that didn't need mending. As night fell, they shared a simple meal. Beans, bread, coffee. They spoke little. The silence felt heavy with everything unsaid. The second day was worse. The storm intensified. They were truly trapped now, surrounded by snow that had drifted higher than the windows. They played cards to pass time, read from Kate's books. James whittled while Kate worked on a quilt, talked about safe things, weather, ranching, literature. But underneath tension built. Not uncomfortable exactly, just the natural strain of forced proximity, of 2 people who'd been alone too long, suddenly thrust into intimate space. That night Kate woke crying. James heard it from his bedroll by the fire, harsh sobs that shook her whole body. He lay still, uncertain, but the sobs continued growing worse, raw and broken. "Kate," he said quietly, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Her voice was muffled. James stood and moved to her bedside. In the dim firelight he could see her sitting up, arms wrapped around herself. "Tell me," he he said. "Tell me about her." And she did. Everything poured out. Rose's birth in this cabin while Daniel was away working. The joy mixed with terror of being alone. How Rose had smiled at 2 months. How she'd reached for Kate's hair and held tight. The sound of her laugh. The weight of her in Kate's arms. Then the fever. The terrible night it came. The desperate ride for Dr. Morrison through darkness with Rose burning hot against her chest. The doctor's arrival. His grim face. His quiet words. Too late. Whooping cough. Nothing to be done. The moment Rose's breathing changed. That horrible rattle. The way her small body went still. "I held her as she died," Kate whispered. "I held her, and I couldn't do anything. Couldn't save her. Couldn't even take away her pain." James sat on the floor beside her bed. He understood that helplessness. The rage of being unable to protect someone you loved. "Tell me about yours," Kate said. So he did. About Elizabeth's labor starting while he was away with a difficult calving. About racing home already knowing he was too late. About arriving to find the midwife's stricken face. About 2 bodies already prepared for burial. About his son, the baby he'd never held, never named, who'd never drawn a single breath. "I didn't get to say goodbye," James said. "Didn't get to tell Elizabeth I was sorry. That I loved her. Nothing. Just cold bodies and graves that needed digging. Does it get easier? It gets different. You make room for it, learn to carry it." Kate reached out in the darkness. Her hand found his. James held it. 2 people who'd known loss finding comfort in shared understanding. They talked until dawn. The storm still raged outside, but inside something had shifted. Defenses had fallen. In the isolation and darkness they'd shown each other their deepest wounds. When light finally came gray and weak through snow-covered windows, they were still sitting together, still holding hands, still talking in quiet voices about pain and survival and the possibility of something beyond mere existence. The 3rd day, the storm began to break. Wind died down. Snow stopped falling. They could see sky again, pale blue between departing clouds. James prepared to leave. He saddled his horse in the barn while Kate made coffee for the journey. When he came to the cabin for it, the air between them felt charged, changed. Something had happened during those 3 days, something neither was quite ready to name. "Thank you," Kate said, "for listening. Thank you for letting me stay." Their eyes met. James took a step toward her, stopped. Whatever was building between them deserved time. Rushing would dishonor what they'd shared, the vulnerability, the trust. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. "Make sure you're safe." Kate nodded, understanding what he didn't say. James rode away. Behind him, Kate stood in the doorway, watching until he disappeared over the ridge. Neither knew that while they'd been isolated in the storm, events had moved forward, that Blackwood's patience had run out, that violence was coming. The time for threats was over. The time for action had begun. The morning after James left, Kate went about her usual chores with a lightness she hadn't felt in months. The storm had cleared. The world looked clean and new under fresh snow. Her heart felt almost the same way, almost hopeful. She was feeding the chickens when she heard horses approaching. 2 riders, men she didn't recognize. Immediately her body tensed. Tommy's warning came back to her. 2 men. Strangers, near her property. She set down the feed bucket slowly, keeping her movements calm. Her eyes scanned for the axe she kept by the woodpile. 20 feet away. Too far. The men reined in their horses. The taller one had a scar running down his left cheek. The other was broader, with dead eyes that looked through her rather than at her. "Mrs. Morrison." The scarred one spoke pleasantly enough, but there was no warmth in it. "Can I help you?" Kate kept her voice steady. "Mr. Blackwood sent us. Final offer, $500. You pack your things and leave today." "I'm not leaving." The scarred man sighed as if disappointed. "That's unfortunate." They dismounted. Kate backed toward the cabin. Her hand found the door handle. "Stay back," she said. The scarred man smiled. "Or what?" Kate lunged for the cabin, got inside, slammed the door. Her hands shook as she threw the bolt. The door shuddered under a heavy impact. Then another. The wood was thick, built to withstand Wyoming winters. But it wouldn't hold forever. Kate grabbed the fireplace poker. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She positioned herself by the door, heart hammering. The impacts stopped. Silence. Then she heard them at the window. The crash of breaking glass, a hand reaching through, fumbling for the latch. Kate swung the poker, connected with knuckles. A howl of pain. The hand withdrew. "Bitch broke my hand." "Calm down." Boss said scare her, not hurt her. "She hurt me first." More silence. Kate's breath came in gasps. She was trapped. If they really wanted in, they'd get in eventually. Then the scarred man's voice closer to the door. "Mrs. Morrison, we're going to leave now, but we're taking something with us. A reminder." She heard them moving, heard the barn door open, heard her milk cow lowing in distress, then a gunshot. Kate's stomach dropped. They'd killed her cow, her only source of milk. One of her few remaining assets. She heard them mount up, heard hoofbeats fading. Only then did she open the door. The scene outside confirmed her fears. Her cow lay dead in the snow, blood spreading in a dark stain. And something else, something that made rage join the fear. They'd gone into the cabin while she was barricaded in the main room, had ransacked it. Broken dishes littered the floor, books torn and scattered. Her violin, Daniel's gift, lay shattered, stomped into pieces. Kate sank to her knees among the wreckage. Not from despair, from fury. They'd taken Rose. They'd taken Daniel. Now they wanted her home, the land where she'd buried everyone she loved. And for what money power? The sheer cruelty of it ignited something in her. She'd been surviving on grief and stubbornness. Now rage joined the mix. She wasn't leaving, ever. They could threaten, could destroy her possessions, could kill her livestock. She was not leaving. Kate stood among the ruins of her cabin and made a decision. She'd fight, with everything she had, for as long as it took. But first she needed James. She saddled her horse and rode for Caldwell Ranch, ignoring the cold, ignoring her shaking hands. She needed to tell him what had happened, needed his help to fight back. Because this wasn't about land anymore. This was about refusing to let evil win. James was in the barn when Kate arrived. One look at her face told him something was wrong. "They came," she said without preamble. "Blackwood's men, this morning, broke my cabin, killed my cow, destroyed everything." James's expression went dark, dangerous. "Did they hurt you?" "No, but they made their point. Leave or it gets worse." "Where were you?" "Inside, barricaded. They couldn't get to me, so they destroyed what they could reach." James's hands clenched. When he spoke, his voice was cold as winter iron. "This ends. Now. No more waiting for legal process. Blackwood declared war. He just doesn't know who he's fighting yet." "What are you going to do?" "What I did in the war. Find the enemy's weakness. Exploit it. End the threat." "You're talking about violence." "I'm talking about protection. There's a difference." He paused. "I've killed men, Kate. During the war. 13 that I know of. Maybe more. I swore when I came home I'd never kill again. But if Blackwood's men come back, if they touch you—" His jaw clenched. "I won't let them hurt you. I won't lose someone else I care about." Kate's breath caught. "Care about?" James met her eyes. "Yes. Care about. More than I should, probably. More than is wise. But I can't help that." She crossed to him, stood close. "Then we fight together. Not just you protecting me. Partners." "Kate, this could get dangerous. My land, my fight. I'm not hiding while you risk your life." James searched her face, saw the steel in her eyes, the determination that had kept her alive through loss after loss. "All right," he said, "together. But we need help." "Who?" "Everyone Blackwood has wronged. And in a town like this, that's more people than you'd think." They gathered allies quickly. Henry Cooper came first, bringing Thomas Reed. Both men had worked for James for years. Both had seen Blackwood's methods firsthand. "We're with you," Henry said simply. "Whatever you need." Dr. Morrison arrived next. He examined Kate's bruised wrists where she'd fought off the intruder's hand, documented everything carefully. "This is assault," he said. "Criminal charges are possible." He paused. "Blackwood tried to buy my practice last year. When I refused, a mysterious fire broke out. No proof, but I knew." More came. Ranchers who'd been pressured to sell water rights, farmers whose crops had been trampled by Blackwood's men, a widow whose husband's debt had been bought and threatened with foreclosure. Each had a story. Each had been targeted. Each had stayed quiet, afraid to fight alone. But together they found courage. Reverend Cross arrived last. He'd been skeptical when Margaret told him about the meeting, but seeing the gathered faces, hearing their stories, changed his mind. "Violence isn't the answer," he said. "However, self-defense is biblical, and defending the widow and orphan is a commandment." He offered the church for their meeting, a safe space to plan. 12 families gathered that evening, not the whole town, but enough. They shared stories, documented abuses, built a case. The plan was simple. Thomas would ride to Cheyenne, request a U.S. Marshal to investigate Blackwood's fraudulent land claims. Meanwhile, the community would make their support for Kate visible, make it clear that hurting her meant facing the entire town. It was a good plan, but plans take time, and time was something Blackwood wouldn't give them. Eleanor Thornton watched from the shadows at the back of the church. She'd come intending to voice her concerns about propriety, about James's frequent visits to the widow's cabin. But seeing Kate's bruised wrists, hearing about the dead cow, the destroyed violin, the ransacked cabin, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in years. Shame. Her gossip had started this. Not directly, perhaps, but she'd provided information, had told Blackwood unknowingly about Kate's vulnerability, about her isolation. Eleanor had thought she was protecting community morals. Turns out she'd armed a predator. She slipped out before anyone noticed her, went home to her large empty house, sat in her parlor surrounded by expensive furniture bought with her dead husband's money. 30 years of bitterness had poisoned her, made her cruel to a young woman whose only crime was being an outsider, being someone James Caldwell chose to help, just like Robert Caldwell had chosen Sarah Wheeler over her. Eleanor had blamed the wrong people. Robert hadn't rejected her because she wasn't good enough. He'd just chosen differently. That wasn't Sarah's fault, wasn't James's fault, and certainly wasn't Kate's fault. But Eleanor's poison had real consequences, had put a young widow in danger. For the first time in decades, Eleanor Thornton felt genuine remorse. She didn't know yet what she could do to make amends, but she knew she had to try. The next morning, Samuel Blackwood sat in his office reviewing reports from his men. The widow had been scared. Good. Fear was an excellent motivator. Then came a knock. One of his hired men entered looking nervous. "We got a problem, boss." "What problem?" "The widow. She's got support now. Caldwell's gathering the town. They're planning to file complaints, requesting a marshal investigation." Blackwood's expression didn't change, but inside cold calculation began. This was unexpected. Most people crumbled under pressure. The widow should have accepted his offer by now. Instead, she'd found allies. James Caldwell specifically, a man with resources and influence. That complicated things. Blackwood pulled out a telegram he'd received yesterday from his partners in Cheyenne. They were getting impatient, wanted results. The coal deposit needed to be secured soon, or they'd find other opportunities. He made a decision. No more half measures, no more waiting. If the widow wouldn't leave peacefully, he'd manufacture a legal crisis, force her off the land through official channels. He had friends in the territorial government, judges who owed favors, officials who could be bought. And if that didn't work well, accidents happened in Wyoming territory. Blackwood began writing letters, calling in favors, setting machinery in motion. Within 3 days, he'd have documents claiming Catherine Morrison had failed to maintain residence requirements, had abandoned the property, had no legal claim. Fraudulent documents, yes, but official-looking enough to require months of legal challenges to overturn. By then, he'd owned the land. He smiled. The widow had spirit, he'd give her that. But spirit didn't win against money and connections. 2 days after the community meeting, Blackwood arrived at Kate's cabin. He came alone, unarmed, in broad daylight, smiling like a friendly neighbor. James was there, had taken to staying in Kate's barn, protecting her. He emerged when he heard the horse. "Mr. Blackwood," James said coldly. "Mr. Caldwell, Mrs. Morrison, might we speak like reasonable people? After what your men did—" James's hand rested on his rifle. "My men." Blackwood's expression was shocked innocence. "I assure you I had no knowledge of any violence. Those men acted without my authority. I came to apologize." "I don't believe you," Kate said. Blackwood's smile thinned. "Believe what you like, but here are the facts. You have no legal claim to this land. I have official documents proving Daniel Morrison abandoned his homestead. You can fight this in court, spend money you don't have, time you can't afford, or accept my offer, now increased to $1,000, quite generous considering." "Considering you forged those records," James said. "Careful, Mr. Caldwell. Accusations of fraud are serious, require proof. Do you have proof?" "We're gathering it." "From Cheyenne. That's 2 days' ride, each way. Who's protecting Mrs. Morrison while you're gone?" Pause. "Or while your friend Thomas makes that trip." The implication was clear. Blackwood knew their plans, had a spy. Someone in their group was reporting back. James's expression hardened. Blackwood noticed and smiled. "Here's what's going to happen," Blackwood said. "Mrs. Morrison sells. Today. Or tomorrow a very tragic accident occurs. Maybe a fire. Maybe structural collapse. Maybe she's found dead from exposure. Wyoming winters are deadly after all." James started forward. Blackwood raised his hand. "Before you do something stupid, consider this. I have 5 men in town. You have, what, a handful of ranchers. The moment violence starts, I'm the victim. You're the aggressor. Law won't side with you. It'll side with the respectable businessman defending himself." "Get off my land," Kate said, voice like ice. "Mrs. Morrison, be reasonable. Get off my land." Blackwood stood slowly. "You have until sunset tomorrow. After that, I can't guarantee your safety." He looked at James. "Or his. Accidents happen to heroes, too." He mounted and rode away. James and Kate stood in the yard, fury and fear mixing. "We can't wait for the marshal," James said. "Blackwood's going to move tonight or tomorrow." "What do? We force his hand. If he comes with his men, we have witnesses. The whole community sees him as the aggressor. And if he comes with corrupt officials, with forged documents—" James was quiet. "Then we trust that justice will prevail." "You don't believe that?" "No, but I believe in us, in this community." He met her eyes. "And if it comes to it, I'll protect you, no matter what." Kate stepped closer. "James, if we're going to fight together, really together, there's something I need to say." "What?" "I love you." The words hung in the air. James stared. "I know it's fast," Kate continued. "I know it's probably foolish, but if tomorrow we're fighting for our lives, I don't want to die without saying it. I love you, not because you're protecting me, because you see me, because you understand grief and still choose hope, because you're the first person since Rose died who makes me want to keep living." James closed the distance between them, cupped her face in his hands, kissed her, deep, desperate. 3 years of locked-away emotion pouring out. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I love you too," James said. "Have since the day I helped bury Rose. Didn't know it then, know it now." "When this is over," Kate started. "When this is over," James finished, "we'll figure out what comes next. Together. Promise. Promise." That night they sat by the fire. James cleaned his rifle. Kate sharpened her kitchen knife. Not much as weapons go, but all they had. Outside, darkness fell. In town, Blackwood gathered his men. 5 against 2 seemed like good odds, but Blackwood had made one critical mistake. He thought this was about land. It wasn't. It was about love, community, and the refusal to let evil win. Tomorrow would decide everything. Dawn came cold and clear. James woke to the sound of horses. Many horses. He looked out the window. 6 men approaching. Blackwood plus 5 hired guns. "Stay low," James said to Kate. "If shooting starts, I'm not hiding." James wanted to argue. Didn't. He handed her a pistol he'd brought from the ranch. Blackwood stopped 50 yards out, shouted across the distance. "Mrs. Morrison, final chance. Walk away now, no one gets hurt." James stepped onto the porch, rifle ready. "She's not leaving." Blackwood smiled. "Mr. Caldwell, the hero, you know you can't win this." "Maybe, but you'll bleed trying." "Will I? Or will I just ride away and let my friends handle it? I have witnesses saying you fired first. Threatening behavior. Self-defense on my part." Then sounds from behind James's position. More horses. James turned, fearing reinforcements for Blackwood, but it was Henry Cooper, leading 15 men, Thomas Reed, Dr. Morrison, Reverend Cross, ranchers from the meeting, even some townspeople James didn't know well. Henry reined in beside James. "Thought you could use some backup." Blackwood's smile faded. "This is a private property dispute," he said. "None of your concern." Reverend Cross stepped forward. "Protecting the widow and orphan is God's concern. And ours." The numbers had shifted. 6 versus 17. Blackwood's advantage evaporated. But he had one card left. "You're all witnesses," Blackwood said loudly. "I came peacefully to resolve a legal matter. Caldwell threatened me with a weapon. I have the law on my side." "Do you?" A new voice. Everyone turned. A rider approached. Older man, weathered face, silver badge gleaming on his chest. U.S. Marshal William Garrett. Thomas had ridden through the night, brought him back. The marshal dismounted, walked straight to Blackwood. "Samuel Blackwood, I have a warrant for your arrest. Fraud, forgery, intimidation. And based on what I'm seeing here, we can add attempted assault." Blackwood's face went white, then red. His men looked at each other, slowly raised their hands. The fight was over before it began, but Blackwood had one last play. As the marshal reached for his hands to bind them, Blackwood's hand shot out, grabbed the marshal's pistol, shoved him aside, aimed at Kate on the porch. "If I can't have that land, nobody can." Everything slowed. James saw the gun swing toward Kate, saw Blackwood's finger tighten on the trigger. He moved without thinking. Dove in front of Kate, pushed her aside. The gunshot was impossibly loud. James felt the impact. His shoulder, fire spreading. He fell. Chaos. Henry tackling Blackwood, the marshal recovering pistol aimed. "Drop it!" Blackwood did. Fight gone. Realized what he'd done. Attempted murder in front of a U.S. Marshal and 20 witnesses. On the porch, Kate knelt over James. James, stay with me." Dr. Morrison ran forward, examined the wound. Bullet through shoulder, missed bone, hit muscle. He's lucky. James, conscious but pale, managed a weak smile. "Lucky, sure, feels great." "You fool," Kate said, tears streaming. "You could have died." "Couldn't let him shoot you." "I had a gun too." "Didn't think, just moved." Dr. Morrison bandaged the wound quickly. "He needs proper treatment. In town." They loaded James into a wagon. Blackwood was dragged away by the marshal, still shouting about connections, about being out by week's end. "Not from territorial prison," Marshal Garrett said grimly. As the wagon pulled away, Kate rode alongside, holding James's hand. The siege was over, the villain defeated. But as she watched blood seep through bandages, she realized victory had a cost. He'd taken a bullet meant for her, put his life on the line. And she knew with absolute certainty that she wanted to marry this man, wanted to build a life with him, if he'd have her. 2 weeks passed. James recovered slowly at the ranch. The shoulder wound was clean but painful. Dr. Morrison visited daily, changing dressings, monitoring for infection. Kate came every day, sat by his bedside, read to him, talked. sometimes just held his hand in comfortable silence. The town's opinion shifted dramatically. What had been scandal became romance. The story spread. The rancher who took a bullet to save the widow. The widow who'd stood her ground against corruption. Even Eleanor Thornton came to visit. She stood in James's doorway, hat in hand, looking more uncertain than anyone had ever seen her. "I owe you both an explanation," Eleanor said, "and an apology." James gestured her in. Kate sat in a chair by his bed, wary. Eleanor sat, took a breath, began. 30 years ago I loved a man, Robert Caldwell, your father James. He was everything I wanted. But I was nobody. Seamstress's daughter. He chose your mother instead. Sarah Wheeler. Land family status. All the things I didn't have." She paused. "I've carried that rejection for 3 decades. Let it poison me. When I saw you, James, showing kindness to an outsider, it felt like mockery. So I tried to destroy it. Destroy the happiness I never had." "You were Blackwood's informant," Kate said. Eleanor nodded. "Not intentionally. I didn't know what he was planning, but I told him things. About you. About James helping you. I thought I was just gossiping. Turns out I was providing ammunition." "You need to leave," Kate said. "I know. But first." Eleanor pulled out an envelope. "Your violin can't be repaired, but this should cover a new one, and other things. It's $500. Restitution for the harm I caused." "I don't want your money," Kate said. "It's not charity. It's payment for a debt. Please, let me do this one small thing." James spoke. "Mrs. Thornton, my father made his choice. It wasn't your fault. Sometimes people just choose differently. Doesn't mean you weren't good enough." Eleanor's eyes filled. "Thank you. That's kinder than I deserve." After she left, Kate stared at the envelope. "Should we keep it?" she asked James. "Your choice." Kate thought. Then, "Yes, we'll use it for something good. I'll decide later." 3 weeks after the shooting, Reverend Cross performed a special service, a blessing of James and Kate's courtship, public acknowledgement before the whole community. "Let no one question the honor of these two," Cross said. "They have proven their worth." The town turned out. Applause when James and Kate stood together, his arm still in a sling. That night, James had nightmares for the first time since the shooting. Woke in cold sweat, crying out. Kate was staying at the ranch now, properly chaperoned by Henry and Thomas in the house. She heard James cry out, went to him. "I couldn't save you," he gasped. "In the dream I was too slow. He shot you. You died. But you weren't slow. I'm here. I'm alive. This time. What about next time? I can't lose someone else, Kate. I can't." She took his face in her hands. "Then don't. Don't lose me. Marry me. Make it official. Make it permanent." James stared. "Are you proposing?" "I am. What do you say, James Caldwell? Will you marry me?" He pulled her close, despite the shoulder pain. "Yes. God, yes. Tomorrow if you want." "Tomorrow's too soon." "But soon. Reverend Cross says he'll be back next month. Spring. When the world is green again." "I can wait a month?" "Barely." They kissed, long and deep, a promise of forever. Spring came like a miracle. The snow melted. The prairie turned green. Wildflowers bloomed everywhere. Indian paintbrush, lupine, prairie roses. In the valley cemetery, grass covered the graves. Rose's wooden cross still stood weathered but solid. Thomas had finished the granite stone, simple and beautiful. Rose Morrison, born May 3, 1885, died January 10, 1886. Beloved daughter. May 15th arrived, exactly 1 year since Kate had come to Wyoming with Daniel. A fitting day for new beginnings. The wedding was small. 20 people gathered at Caldwell Ranch. Kate wore a simple blue calico dress she'd sewn herself, carried wildflowers, prairie roses, and blue flax. James wore his Sunday best and couldn't stop smiling. Reverend Cross performed the ceremony with genuine joy. The vows were traditional, but deeply felt. I, James Caldwell, take you, Catherine Wallace, to be my wife. I promise to love you in grief and in joy, to stand with you in hardship and plenty, to honor your strength and support your weakness, as long as we both shall live. I, Catherine Wallace, take you, James Caldwell, to be my husband. I promise to love you in darkness and light, to walk beside you, not behind you, to build with you a life worth living, as long as we both shall live. James slipped the ring on her finger. His mother's ring saved for years. Kate gave him a ring made from the broken violin. Thomas had melted pieces, crafted them into a band. Music and love forged together, Thomas had said. By the power vested in me, Reverend Cross said, I now pronounce you husband and wife. James, you may kiss your bride. The kiss drew applause and cheers. Tommy shouted, Can we eat cake now? Everyone laughed. The reception was simple but joyful. Food brought by the community. Music when Kate played the new violin Thomas had made her. Her first song was a waltz. James and Kate's first dance as husband and wife. He winced from his shoulder. Should I lead? She teased. Don't push your luck, he replied, grinning. As sunset approached, James and Kate slipped away, walked to the cemetery together. They stood at Rose's grave, at Elizabeth's grave nearby, stood in silence, hands clasped. Do you think they'd approve? Kate asked. I think they'd want us to be happy. Are you happy? James turned to her, cupped her face. Happier than I ever thought I'd be again. They left flowers, blue flax on Rose's grave, prairie roses on Elizabeth's, walked home as the sun set, painting everything gold. The months that followed were an adjustment, learning to share space, learning each other's habits. James rose before dawn. Kate liked to read late. He was methodical. She was intuitive. But they complemented each other, filled in gaps. Kate started teaching children to read in her old cabin, now a schoolhouse. James expanded the ranch with Henry as full partner. Together they planted a garden. Together they faced small challenges. Sick cattle, a drought scare that ended with blessed rain, normal problems of normal life. And slowly grief's weight lightened, not gone, never gone, but easier to carry when shared. One August evening Kate had news. They sat on the porch watching sunset. She took his hand, placed it on her stomach. James, I'm pregnant. He went very still. Are you sure? Dr. Morrison confirmed it today. Silence. Then, how do you feel? Scared, hopeful, terrified, happy. All of it. James's fear was written on his face. Elizabeth died in childbirth. I know. What if... James, look at me. She waited until he did. I'm not Elizabeth. This isn't then. Dr. Morrison is good. I'm healthy. And you'll be here, not 20 miles away. Here. I'll be here, I promise. Not leaving your side. I'm counting on it. They held each other. Fear mixed with joy. Past mixed with future. A baby. New life. The possibility of family rebuilt from ashes. May 1887, 1 year after the wedding. Kate was heavily pregnant, due any day. They sat on the porch in the evening. James had made her a rocking chair. She sat in it, his hand on her belly, feeling the baby move. Kate played her violin, a song she'd written, called it The Thaw, about winter ending, spring coming, love growing. Do you remember last year? She asked. This time, our wedding, best day of my life. Even with the shoulder still healing. Even then. The baby kicked hard. Both laughed. James felt the movement, wonder in his eyes. Strong, he said. Like the mother. Or the father. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky. The prairie stretched endless before them, home behind them, future inside Kate. Are you ready? Kate asked. To be a father. No. Terrified, actually. Good. Me too. We'll be terrified together. Can we do this? Build a family after everything? I don't know, but I know we survived winter. We survived grief. We survived men who wanted to destroy us. A baby. We'll figure it out. Promise. Promise." Music drifted over the prairie. In the distance, Tommy ran through Henry and Mary's yard chasing their toddler. In town, families gathered for evening meals. In the cemetery, flowers bloomed on 2 graves tended by love that wouldn't forget. And on the porch of Caldwell Ranch, 2 people who'd lost everything sat together, waiting for new life to begin. The frozen ground had finally thawed. Spring had come, and love, stubborn and resilient as prairie grass, had survived. 3 days later, on May 20th, Catherine Caldwell went into labor. James stayed by her side through every moment, held her hand, wiped her forehead, never left. Dr. Morrison delivered a healthy baby boy, 8 pounds, strong lungs. Perfect. "A son," Morrison said, placing the baby in Kate's arms. James looked at his child, his living, breathing, crying son, felt tears he'd held back for 4 years finally break free. "Daniel James Caldwell," Kate said. "Daniel for the father he'll never meet. James for the father who'll never leave." James's throat tightened. "That's perfect." James held them both, his wife, his son, his family. The grief would always be there. Elizabeth, the first baby. Rose, the losses that had brought them together. But now there was this. New life. Second chances. The stubborn, defiant choice to hope. Years later, Daniel James Caldwell would grow up hearing stories about the grandmother and big sister he never met, about the frozen January that brought his parents together, about love that survived loss. And every spring without fail, James and Kate would plant blue flax on a small grave in the Valley Cemetery. Because love, real love, doesn't erase the past. It honors it and builds something new alongside it. The Caldwells built that new life in Wyoming territory, where winters were long and ground was hard. But the hearts that endured were harder still.